There is a moment, just before sleep takes hold, when the world is quiet and the soul is most open. God often speaks in this sacred stillness. Not in thunder or flame, but in the gentle whisper of peace. If you have found yourself here, know it is not by accident. You were led here for a reason. The day's burdens, betrayal, financial worries, loneliness, may weigh heavily upon your heart, but you were never meant to carry them alone. Before you close your eyes tonight, God asks you to lay it all at His feet. Release the fear, the anger, the sorrow. Speak to Him, not with rehearsed words, but with the honesty of a child turning to their father. For prayer is not a mere ritual. It is an exchange, a surrender, a profound act of trust, and in that trust, you will find rest. The night of surrender. Jonah sat alone in his dimly lit chamber, the weight of countless burdens pressing against his chest, the echoes of betrayal, the sting of financial ruin, and the dull ache of loneliness gathered like shadows around him. He had spent his days striving, wrestling with life's misfortunes, yet night always came with the same relentless whisper. You are alone in this struggle. He had prayed before, but his words often felt like they dissolved into the air. Tonight, though, something felt different. As Jonah turned toward the small oil lamp beside his bed, a gentle knock sounded at his door. Hesitant but curious, he opened it to find an old traveler, cloaked in a simple robe, his face lined with years of wisdom. "May I rest here for the night?" the traveler asked. Jonah hesitated. He had nothing to offer. No feast, no comfort, not even the certainty of his own peace. But something about the man's gaze, calm and unwavering, compelled him to step aside. As the traveler settled by the fire, he spoke softly. "Your heart is heavy." Jonah exhaled sharply, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "That is an understatement." The traveler nodded. "And you've tried to carry it all yourself." Jonah tensed. He wanted to deny it, but what would be the point? The truth was evident. "I don't see any other choice." The traveler picked up a dry branch from the firewood pile and held it. "Tell me, Jonah, what happens to a branch cut from the vine?" Jonah frowned. "It withers. It becomes dry, brittle, lifeless." The traveler smiled. "And yet, you have severed yourself from the source, expecting to remain strong." He tossed the branch into the fire, and in an instant, it was consumed by the flames. Jonah watched in silence, his pulse quickening. "So, what am I supposed to do?" The traveler leaned forward. "Surrender." Jonah flinched. Surrender. The word felt like defeat, like giving up. But the traveler continued. "Before you sleep tonight, take all that weighs you down, your fears, your losses, your doubts, and lay them at the feet of the one who never slumbers. Do not carry them into the night as if they were yours to bear alone." Jonah swallowed. He had always believed in God, but had he ever truly trusted Him? The traveler's words stirred something deep within him, an ache for rest that no effort, no striving had ever satisfied. That night, as Jonah knelt beside his bed, he spoke, not with grand eloquence, but with raw honesty. "Lord, I cannot hold this anymore. Take it, the fear, the sorrow, the anger. If you are truly near, let me rest in you." The moment he spoke, it was as if an unseen weight lifted from his shoulders. His body did not suddenly become rich, nor did his troubles vanish, but a peace settled over him, gentle, undeniable. He climbed into bed, and for the first time in years, he slept without the chains of worry binding him. The traveler was gone when morning came, but his presence lingered in Jonah's soul. The burdens of yesterday had not returned to claim him, and as he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air, he knew. God had not called him to endure life alone. The battle had never been his to fight alone. It had always belonged to the Lord. The weight of worry and the gift of release. Ethan had always carried his burdens alone. As he lay in bed each night, the weight of the day's worries settled over him like an iron cloak. His mind raced with unpaid debts, broken relationships, and unfulfilled dreams. He prayed, but his prayers felt hollow, as if they dissolved into the air before reaching heaven. One evening, as the moon cast silver light over the quiet countryside, Ethan visited an old friend, Father Matthias, a wise and gentle man who had spent decades guiding weary souls. They sat together in the monastery garden, surrounded by olive trees that whispered in the wind. "Why do you look so troubled, my son?" Father Matthias asked, studying Ethan's furrowed brow. "I pray every night," Ethan admitted, his voice low. "But my worries remain. I tell God about my struggles, yet they don't go away." Father Matthias smiled knowingly. "Tell me, what do you do next when you finish praying?" Ethan hesitated. "I wait for peace, but it never comes, so I get up and carry on, hoping tomorrow will be better." The old priest chuckled. "Ah, so that's the problem." He picked up a small stone and handed it to Ethan. "Hold this," he said. Then he reached for another stone and placed it in Ethan's hands, and another, and another. Soon, Ethan's arms were full, heavy with smooth, cool weight. "Now, my son," Father Matthias continued, "release them." Ethan blinked. "Release them?" "Yes, drop them at your feet." Slowly, Ethan let go. One by one, the stones tumbled to the ground, the weight lifting from his arms. He flexed his fingers, surprised by the sudden lightness. Father Matthias nodded. "This is what you must do with your burdens. You bring them to God, but you do not let them go. You clutch them tightly, as if they are yours to bear forever. But faith is not just about speaking your worries, but about releasing them." Ethan swallowed. "But how do I know God will take them?" The old man's eyes twinkled. "Because he already has." He gestured to the cross that stood at the edge of the garden. "Do you not remember what was done there? Every burden, every sorrow, every fear was already carried. You are merely asked to surrender them." That night, for the first time in years, Ethan prayed differently. He did not merely speak his burdens, he laid them down. One by one, he placed his worries at the feet of the Almighty, no longer grasping them as his own. The whisper in the night. Jonah had always found the night to be the most restless part of his day. As soon as he lay down, his mind would flood with worries. Unpaid debts, unspoken regrets, unfinished dreams. He would toss and turn, searching for sleep, but finding only the hollow silence of his own thoughts. He often wondered why God felt so distant. He went to the temple, he listened to the teachings, and he even whispered prayers before meals. Yet when he needed peace the most, it eluded him. His prayers felt like words thrown into the wind, unanswered, unheard. One evening, after another exhausting day, he wandered outside and sat beneath an old olive tree. The night was cool, and the stars were scattered like golden dust across the heavens. Jonah sighed and muttered a few words of prayer, more out of habit than faith. "God, if you are listening, I need help." The wind stirred the branches above him, and a voice, soft yet unmistakable, spoke from the stillness. "Why do you only speak when you are desperate?" Jonah sat up, his heart pounding. He turned, but there was no one. The trees stood silent, the fields beyond lay motionless in the moonlight. Yet the voice had been real as his own breath. "Who's there?" he asked. The voice did not come from any visible source, yet it resonated deep within him. "You call me in distress, yet I have always called to you." Jonah swallowed hard. "I don't know how to hear you." A gentle rustling of leaves answered him. "You fill your days with noise and your nights with worry. But I am not in the storm nor in the fire. I am in the whisper." Jonah closed his eyes, the words settling over him like a warm mantle. He thought of how he had spent his days, always moving, always striving, always drowning in the anxieties of tomorrow. He had never made room for silence. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. Deek as a child speaks to his father, not with rehearsed words but with honesty. Jonah did not recite a formal prayer for the first time in years. He did not try to sound righteous or wise. Instead, he spoke plainly. He told God about his fears, his failures, his longings for peace. He spoke of the nights he had spent alone with his thoughts, wondering if he was seen, if he was loved. As he spoke, something remarkable happened. The weight on his heart began to lift. The silence, which had once tormented him, now felt like a sacred space. When he finally finished, the voice whispered again, "Prayer is not a performance, but an exchange of trust. You speak, and I listen. I speak, and you learn to hear." Jonah opened his eyes. The night had not changed, and yet everything felt different. The olive tree still stood tall, the wind still moved through its leaves, but the air was filled with a presence he had never noticed before. From that night forward, Jonah no longer dreaded the quiet. He embraced it, knowing that in the stillness God was always near. He began to spend his nights differently. Instead of tossing and turning, he would step outside and sit beneath the tree, letting his heart pour out in conversation. He did not always hear a voice, but he always felt the presence. And as the days passed, he noticed a change in himself. The worries that once consumed him lost their power. He still faced challenges, but they no longer defined him. He still had burdens, but he no longer carried them alone. The burden and the whisper. Ethan trudged along the narrow path, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of a great sack. Each step was harder than the last, but he dared not stop. The sack was filled with worries, some his own, others given to him by those who had long since disappeared from his life. Fear, regret, shame, and sorrow all pressed upon him, making his journey almost unbearable. He had heard rumors of a place beyond the hills where one could lay down their burdens and find rest, but the thought seemed foolish. Who could take away such a weight? Who would even want to? And yet, something within him whispered, "Come." The path led him into a dense forest where the air was thick with silence. Only the sound of his own labored breathing broke the stillness. Then, suddenly, a voice, soft but clear. "Why do you carry such a burden?" Ethan stopped and turned. There, seated upon a large stone, was a man clothed in simple garments. His eyes held the depth of eternity, yet his presence radiated the warmth of a familiar friend. Ethan hesitated. "Because I must," he finally replied. "These burdens are mine to bear." The man stood and gestured toward a nearby tree, beneath which lay a smooth, empty space. "Lay them down. You were never meant to carry them alone." Ethan clutched the sack tighter. "But I've carried them for so long. If I set them down, who will hold them?" The man smiled gently. "Give them to me." A battle raged within Ethan. Could he trust this stranger? Could he surrender the weight he had carried for so long? His fingers trembled as he loosened the straps. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered the sack to the ground. A wave of relief washed over him the moment it left his shoulders. He had not realized how weary he had become until the burden was gone. He looked up, expecting to see the man struggle under the weight of the sack. But, to his astonishment, it was gone. Vanished, as if it had never existed. But how?" Ethan stammered. The man placed a hand on his shoulder. "Some burdens are not meant to be carried, but surrendered." Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. He wanted to speak, to ask more questions, but the man simply pointed ahead. "Now walk and listen. Do not fill the silence with your own voice. Let your heart be still. You will hear the answers you seek." For the first time in a long while, Ethan did not feel the need to hurry. He walked forward, his steps unburdened, his heart open, and in the quiet, he heard the whisper again. Not outside, but within. "Come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest." And Ethan knew he had found the place beyond the hills at last. As he journeyed on, he found the silence no longer empty. It was filled with a presence, a peace he had never known before. He began to notice things he had once overlooked: the rustling of leaves, the soft chirping of birds, the gentle warmth of the sun filtering through the trees. Each step brought a renewed sense of freedom, as though his soul had been unchained. One evening, as he rested by a small brook, he saw another traveler struggling under the weight of his own sack. The man staggered, sweat pouring down his brow, eyes filled with despair. Ethan recognized that look all too well. Rising to his feet, he approached the traveler and extended a hand. "You don't have to carry that alone," Ethan said gently. "There is a place where you can lay it down." The traveler hesitated, his grip tightening around the sack. "But I've carried it for so long. If I let it go, what will be left of me?" Ethan smiled, recalling his own doubts not so long ago. "What will be left is freedom. Trust me. When you surrender the weight, you will not lose yourself. You will find who you were always meant to be." The traveler's eyes searched Ethan's, looking for certainty, and then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he took his first step toward the place beyond the hills. The gardener's hands. Elias had always been a man of great ambition. He clung tightly to his plans, relationships, and failures, as if they were treasures rather than burdens. Each pursuit, each carefully laid scheme seemed vital to his identity. But as the years passed, he found himself increasingly exhausted. His efforts bore little fruit, and his spirit grew weary. He prayed for strength, but instead of greater endurance, he felt the slow unraveling of everything he had built. One by one, the things he had once held dear began slipping through his fingers like sand. One evening, as he walked through the vineyard outside his home, he noticed an old man tending to a gnarled tree. The man's hands were steady, his movements precise. Elias watched as he cut away branches, some of which still held green leaves, their edges trembling in the soft breeze. 24. "Why'd you cut those?" Elias asked. "They still have life in them." The old man smiled, his face creased with wisdom. "Ah, but they hinder the tree's true growth. They sap its strength, keeping it from bearing sweeter fruit." Elias frowned. "But they are a part of the tree." The gardener nodded. "Indeed, just as many things in your life have been a part of you. Your habits, ambitions, and attachments. But not all things that grow are meant to remain. Some must be pruned for the soul to flourish." Elias hesitated. "But isn't that painful?" The gardener met his eyes, his gaze deep with knowing. "Yes. But would you rather cling to what slows you down, or trust the one who shapes you?" Elias felt a stirring in his heart. He realized that his struggles were not signs of divine neglect, but of divine pruning. His losses were not punishments, but preparations for something greater. He had spent so long grasping at things he thought he needed, fearing that he would be nothing without them. Yet here, standing before this tree, he saw a different truth. Growth often requires loss, and surrender is not defeat, but transformation. As the days passed, Elias began to let go. Old fears loosened their grip. Toxic relationships faded. Even certain dreams, once held with white-knuckled resolve, slipped away. It was not easy. At times it felt like he was being reduced to nothing. The silence left in the wake of his former pursuits was unsettling. There were moments when he questioned if he had made a mistake, if he had surrendered too much. Yet in that stillness, something new began to take root. Slowly, peace, like a gentle rain, settled upon his soul. His burdens lifted, and in their place new growth began. His prayers changed, not for more, but for wisdom to recognize what truly mattered. He learned to trust, not in his own understanding, but in the hands that pruned him. One morning, he returned to the vineyard and found the old gardener beside the once barren tree. Now its branches were laden with fruit, rich and abundant, bending under the weight of their own blessing. The man turned to Elias and said, "You see, young one, the master prunes not to harm, but to heal. What he removes, he replaces with something far greater." Elias reached out and plucked one of the ripe fruits, feeling its warmth in his palm. As he bit into it, sweetness flooded his senses, deeper and richer than anything he had ever tasted before. And in that moment, he understood. To walk with God is to trust his hands, even when they wield the shears. For in divine pruning, there is not loss, but transformation, and in surrender there is not emptiness, but a fullness that only he can provide. The watchman's prayer. The night was darker than usual. Clouds covered the sky, and the only sound in the village of Elrith was the occasional whisper of the wind against the wooden shutters. Samuel sat by the small window of his home, staring into the emptiness beyond. The weight of his burdens pressed upon him like a millstone around his neck. For years he had been faithful. He had worked diligently, provided for his family, and sought to walk in righteousness. Yet, misfortune seemed to follow him like a relentless shadow. His crops had failed that season, his debts mounted. His son lay sick in the next room, his fever unbroken despite every remedy. Samuel clenched his fists, his heart heavy with despair. A quiet voice nudged his soul, "Pray." Samuel hesitated. He had prayed many times, and yet silence had been his only answer. What more could he say that had not already been said? But something deep within urged him still. He rose, knees trembling, and knelt beside his wooden chair. "Lord, are you listening?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have tried. I have done all that is right. But I am weary. My strength is gone. Where are you?" The room remained silent, save for his son's steady breathing in the next room. But as he closed his eyes, something shifted. Not outside, but within him. A peace, unexplainable yet undeniable, settled over his heart. It was not the answer he had expected, no miraculous voice, no thunder from heaven. Yet in that moment, he knew he was not alone. A memory surfaced, an old lesson his father had once told him. The night watchman does not fear the darkness, for he knows the morning will come. Samuel opened his eyes. He did not have the solutions to his problems, but he had something greater, a certainty that God had heard him. And that was enough. As the days passed, Samuel's burdens did not vanish overnight, but small mercies appeared, like morning dew on dry ground. A neighbor, unasked, brought food for his family. A healer from a distant town passed through and offered medicine for his son. Work came unexpectedly from a merchant in need of strong hands. Little by little, the storm that had threatened to consume him began to break apart. It was then that Samuel understood. Prayer had not changed his circumstances immediately, but it had changed him. It had given him strength when he had none left. It had reminded him that he was seen, known, and held by hands far greater than his own. One night as he knelt again in prayer, Samuel did not come with desperate pleas. This time, his words were simple. "Thank you, Lord. You were there all along." And in the quiet of that night, the peace of God wrapped around him like a watchman's cloak, guarding his heart until the dawn. The gardener's hands. Elias had always been a man of great ambition. He clung tightly to his plans, relationships, and failures, as if they were treasures rather than burdens. He believed that perseverance alone would secure his future. Yet, as the years passed, he found himself increasingly exhausted. His efforts bore little fruit, and his spirit grew weary. He prayed for strength, but instead of greater endurance, he felt the slow unraveling of everything he had built. His business ventures crumbled, friendships dissolved, and even the dreams he had nurtured since childhood seemed to slip beyond his grasp. It was as though a great unseen hand was stripping him bare, removing piece by piece the life he had so carefully constructed. One evening, as he walked through the vineyard outside his home, he noticed an old man tending to a gnarled tree. The man's hands were steady, his movements precise. Elias watched as he cut away branches, some of which still held green leaves. He hesitated before speaking, his voice laced with both curiosity and frustration. "And you cut those?" Elias asked. "They still have life in them?" The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling with a quiet knowing. "Ah, but they hinder the tree's true growth. They sap its strength, keeping it from bearing sweeter fruit." Elias frowned. "But they are a part of the tree." The gardener nodded. "Indeed, just as many things in your life have been a part of you, your habits, ambitions, and attachments. But not all things that grow are meant to remain. Some must be pruned for the soul to flourish." Elias hesitated. "But isn't that painful?" The gardener met his eyes, his gaze deep with wisdom. "Yes. But would you rather cling to what slows you down, or trust the one who shapes you?" Elias felt a stirring in his heart. He realized that his struggles were not signs of divine neglect, but of divine pruning. His losses were not punishments, but preparations for something greater. Yet the thought of surrender still terrified him. If he let go, Would there be anything left of him? Would he not become an empty shell, devoid of purpose? As the days passed, Elias began to let go. Not all at once, but little by little. Old fears loosened their grip. Toxic relationships faded. Even certain dreams, once held with white-knuckled resolve, slipped away. It was not easy. At times it felt as though he was being reduced to nothing. He wrestled with the temptation to take matters back into his own hands, to rebuild what had been torn down, but he resisted, recalling the gardener's words. Then something remarkable happened. Peace, like a gentle rain, settled upon his soul. Where anxiety had once reigned, trust took root. Where exhaustion had weighed him down, he found rest, and in that stillness, new growth began. Not of his own making, but something divinely planted. He started to notice joy in simple things, a clarity he had never known, and an unwavering sense that he was being guided, even in uncertainty. One morning he returned to the vineyard and found the old gardener standing beside the once barren tree. Now its branches were laden with fruit, rich and abundant. The man turned to Elias and said, "You see, young one, the master prunes not to harm but to heal. What he removes, he replaces with something far greater." Elias looked at the tree, then at his own life, and understood. The struggles, the losses, the seeming setbacks, they had not been meant to break him, but to transform him. He had feared being emptied, but now he saw that only empty hands could receive what was truly meant for them. And so, Elias learned that to walk with God is to trust his hands, even when they wield the shears, for in divine pruning there is not loss, but transformation. The weaver's hands. Samuel sat by the fire, his hands clenched in frustration. The weight of his burdens had become too great to bear. His crops had failed, his debts mounted, and his prayers seemed to vanish into the vast, indifferent sky. That evening, his grandfather, an old man with eyes full of years and wisdom, sat beside him. "You seem troubled, my son," he said gently. Samuel sighed. "I do not understand, grandfather. I have worked hard, prayed fervently, and my troubles multiply. If God has a plan, why does he not show it to me? Why must I suffer so?" The old man chuckled softly. "Come with me, there is something you must see." He led Samuel into the small workshop behind their home. The room smelled of wood and dust, and in its center stood a loom, half covered with an intricate weaving. The patterns were rich and detailed, yet Samuel frowned at the threads hanging loose at the edges, at the knots and tangles where the colors did not seem to belong. "It is unfinished," Samuel observed. "The design looks chaotic, some threads do not match." His grandfather nodded and handed him a chair. "Sit and let me show you something." Samuel sat, watching as the old man worked. Thread by thread his grandfather wove with careful hands. He selected strands that seemed mismatched, weaving them into the design until, suddenly, their purpose became clear. Colors Samuel thought out of place now formed part of a grander picture. What once looked like a flaw now became a stroke of beauty. "You see," the old man said, "from where you sit, the design seems unclear. But I, the weaver, see the full pattern. Each thread, even the dark ones, has its purpose." Samuel sat in silence, watching the cloth take shape. The knots, the loose threads, the strange colors, all had a place in the weaver's plan. His grandfather turned to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "God is the great weaver, Samuel. You see only the tangled threads of your life, but he sees the full design. Trust him. In time, you will see that even your hardships have their place in his plan." That night, for the first time in months, Samuel prayed without pleading, without questioning. He simply laid his worries before God, like loose threads in the hands of the master weaver, trusting that one day he would see the beauty in the design. And with that trust came peace, deeper than he had ever known.